What is up, entrepreneurs? Welcome back to the Overwhelmed series, or the Camera Basics series. I'm just going to be calling it the Overwhelmed series moving forward. This series is to help you stop being so overwhelmed when it comes to trying to learn video. You're not trying to be a photographer or filmmaker and all of that. So if you want to see the full playlist, as well as the series that actually accompanies this as well, which is the How To in the Real World series, you can check out the information card up above. But in this video, we're going to be jumping into the exposure triangle. So I don't want you to get super overwhelmed. There's going to be a ton of videos that if one area or something is not really kind of taking hold for you, you can go to the specific video that's dedicated for it. So we're going to be mentioning things like aperture, ISO, shutter speed, and things like that, showing you what that looks like on a camera, and just really kind of taking our time going through some of these concepts. If you want to kind of go through this in the pace that this is created for the people on this channel, then I would highly suggest you keep listening, grab a notepad, a pen, and your camera, and let's get to it. So if you've ever noticed with your videos that they're really dark, or they're really bright in a way that you don't like, or you can move forwards and backwards, and you're noticing as you move, it's like flashes of light kind of coming over the screen, and you really don't like that. Those kinds of characteristics in a video are going to deal with the exposure. And just to briefly kind of show you what that's like, on my camera, I'm going to adjust the ISO, and I'll get into what that is. But from where I am right now, if I'm going too dark, and that's way too dark than what I really want, and I find like I've done the whole video and it looks like this and I don't like it, that's an exposure issue. If I'm all the way up and maybe I'm okay, I can kind of maybe make me look okay, certain parts of my parts of my cheek, if I have my phone where some of this is white, like in all the walls, it's starting to look really crazy, looks a little weird, that's an exposure problem. And then to where I had it set before, then now things look a little bit better, a little bit more normal in the way that I would want, that's an exposure problem. There are a couple different ways that you can handle that, more than one way to skin a cat, so to speak. But if you notice any of those characteristics in your videos, then you're having what's called exposure issues. So this is the exposure triangle that's going to help with that. The exposure triangle is called a triangle for a reason. It has three key components. Now, if any of these terms, again, as we're going through the video, or you finish the video and you're like, you want to know more, it's not quite seating, and just honestly, regardless, if you are an entrepreneur, this is stuff new to you, go and continue going through the series. So the first part is going to be the aperture. The aperture is that number. When you look on the screen of your camera, you'll see f1.2 or f3.5. You'll also see this on the front of your lens, and that will be something we get into a little bit later, but you'll see it to say, like for a kit lens, for example, maybe it says something like f3.5 to f5.6. But you really are probably going to identify it as the F number, or the F stop, that is also commonly known as. That's another term that we have. And then you'll see it, the way I like to describe it, easiest way to see it is it may look as a decimal number, like again the 3.5, and it can even go up to things like 15, 16, 17, doesn't matter. So that's the first part of this triangle. And then you have the other parts that are the shutter speed. The shutter speed deals with motion blur, and so this can get pretty wonky, and then so we'll just try to keep this as me try not to be super goofy. So with this, so let's adjust the shutter speed on the camera. Now as you can see, I'm getting lower, and the lower that this gets, the video seems to get a little slow. I'm at 1/5, and that means the video got brighter, and I'm moving like Stevie Wonder, and the video got brighter, it added more light, but the lower that number becomes, it kind of looks like a fraction, the more it kind of looks like I'm in a bad dream or a bad trip. But the more that I adjust this shutter speed, this number that looks like a fraction, the darker that it becomes, and that blur, that motion blur kind of has gone away. So if I bring that back to where it was before, then now stuff just kind of looks normal, and that's what we want when it comes to video, unless you're doing it for a stylistic choice. that you want it to look that way, but if you don't, then it's some things we need to learn to fix that. So that's the shutter speed. Not only will that deal with brightness and darkness, it can also affect the motion blur. And for the purposes of video, it affects motion blur. So if you're not trying to be all, you know, in a dream-like crazy state like we were when I made that number lower, then you want to make sure that you're going to be abiding by some rules that we're going by. So that is the shutter speed. So far we've gone through two parts of this triangle. We have the aperture, we have the shutter speed. Third part of this triangle is what's called the ISO. Now, ISO, to my understanding, doesn't stand for anything. It's just ISO. So you'll hear people say ISO or ISO. And what they're referring to, it's like, I like to think of it as artificial light, but it's really just light sensitivity on the camera. So to show you what that looks like, as I bring that number down, this number can range. That will not deal with motion. It won't deal with anything like that. It just is solely dealing with light. But the more I bring that up, then the brighter it becomes. So now I'm at 20,000 on the ISO and things are looking really crazy. But as I bring that down to where I had it before, now things are looking a little bit normal, like I wanted it. So that is the ISO. So as you can see, everything on this triangle can deal with how bright something is or how dark it is. But like when we dealt with the aperture, yes, it can make things brighter or darker, but it also makes things blurry or not blurry. Shutter speed deals with making sure the motion is normal to what we can kind of see with our eyes naturally. But if that number gets lower, like, and I'm saying it in the way that you can really understand, not necessarily the most, you know, photographer and filmmaker way to say things. So if you're like, well, they say it's a stop down or a stop up, I'm not going that deep with this series. So again, if you really want to get into that stuff, maybe go to a cinematographer's channel or something like that, because for entrepreneurs, we don't really care. So that's the inside secret of this series. It's just keeping it simple, okay? So the shutter speed is going to deal with, like, the lower that number is, then the more it's like, yeah, it's bringing more light, but things are also starting to get really crazy looking. And so you don't want to do that when it comes to video, again, unless you're doing it on purpose. So when we start to adjust and move things around on this triangle, it can make things either look normal, make them look kind of weird, or just flat out make it look bad. But for the purposes of video, we're dealing with the exposure to either brighten things up or darken things down or get it right where we want it to be, so that things are quote unquote properly exposed. Meaning nothing is too bright, like those lights aren't extremely bright behind me, nor is my face just completely whited out so that the camera can't say, like, we don't even know what that is. We can't read any information anymore. And that things that are super dark aren't just like the camera is having difficulties, like, we don't know what the heck that is. It's too dark. We can't pull any additional information out of what the camera is seeing. So those are the three components of the exposure triangle. Now, as we move further into the series, then we'll start to break down some other areas of how this affects video. When can you break certain rules? Like, we'll talk about the 180-degree shutter rule when it comes to video, because there's another component. It's not part of the exposure triangle, but when it comes to doing video, it is important, and that's frame rates. And so we'll do a dedicated video specifically on frame rates. Again, the whole series for this playlist is going to be linked up above. But when it comes to the exposure triangle, the general overview for that, those are the three areas of it: the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. And how we move things will determine how things look on our video. Now, my specific cheat sheet for this, and there will be specific downloadables, free PDFs that'll accompany this, so any specific ones can be linked down below, and you can get that same way if you're familiar with the Canon M50 for video series. There's a video guide with that. So because of the intensity of some of the topics, the terms and things like that, I'll go through and it'll be a bunch of different ones as this series releases. And if you're watching it after the fact, then you can, again, link down below for the specific guides or cheat sheets that'll accompany it, that'll kind of make it a little easier to just kind of you know, refresh your memory when it comes to some of this stuff. So for our purposes for video, aperture, shutter speed, ISO, that's the exposure triangle, and it's going to help us to really get the image to look as normal as we want it to be, or depending on the light and the darkness of an image, we just kind of want to adjust things to make it look normal. Not too bright, not too dark, but if you want a stylistic look in your video at that point, maybe want to make it look like a dreamlike state, you know I can adjust the shutter speed and that changes things. But there are some things when it comes to the exposure triangle we aren't going to touch. We're going to kind of set it and forget it like most infomercials would be. And that's going to be the shutter speed, because it's not too many times that I've found in doing videos for myself personally or even for clients where I need to step outside of the rules per se in video and really adjust that. There are times when you can, or you should, and I'll talk about that specifically in the shutter speed portion, but for the most part, we're going to keep that locked in to a specific range, and we're probably not going to touch it, which means that that area of the triangle is one we don't have to worry about, which really only means it's 2 areas when it comes to the lighting of a video that we're going to bother with, and that's the aperture and that's the ISO. So that's the exposure triangle as an overview.